I assume that I'm live now in this important 1893 Mtokazi Human Rights Restoration Movement project and public lecture. My specific topic has to do with the Gukurahundi genocide as what was a genocide, which is the destruction of human bodies in large-scale terms, mass murders accompanied by massacres and other festivals of cruelty. But what I want to deposit today is that this genocide was also an epistemicide. By epistemicide, I refer to the killing of knowledge, the killing of history, the destruction of truth, and erasure of information about the victims of the Gukurahundi genocide. So my assertion today in this presentation is that over and above the genocide, Gukurahundi was an epistemicide. That history was killed, and that information and truth were killed, and that certain historical and political truths were before, during, and after that genocide destroyed in what Jack Goody calls the theft of history. Gukurahundi was also a theft of history. So epistemicide refers to the killing of a people's history, culture, language, knowledge, and memory. And it is also an erasure of a people's identity and their being. And in insisting that Gukurahundi was also an epistemicide, I have to make the addition that the epistemicide began before the genocide. It continued to happen during the genocide. And it continues to take place well after the Gukurahundi guns have been silenced. So, as I speak, Gukurahundi as an epistemicide is a crime against humanity that is happening as I make this presentation today. The topic that is presented to you in the poster that my colleagues circulated is on the Unity Accord and the present exhumations of Gukurahundi bodies that are taking place. I would like to make an observation that the Unity Accord itself and such processes as these exhumations that are taking place are part of the crime of Gukurahundi as an epistemicide. They are not part of the solution, but part of the problem, in that they constitute attempts by the perpetrators of Gukurahundi to conceal rather than reveal truths, knowledge, history, and other facts about the genocide itself. They are performances that are attempts to silence and erase the truth rather than expose it for all to see. And this accompanies part of the way in which the Gukurahundi genocide itself has been named, especially in the Zimbabwean official and regime communications, the official journalism, some regime scholars, and government communication. Gukurahundi is referred to as disturbances, the civil war, the conflict in Matebeleland, the unrest, or the dissident problem. All of which are names that are given to the genocide and the epistemicide that tend to conceal rather than reveal the truth about the genocide. That as it is important for us to participate in unmasking the true and also correct and just nature of the Kukuraundi genocide and the epistemicide that accompanied it. It was not disturbances. It was not civil war. There were no two armies that were confronting each other. It was not just conflict. And it was more than unrest. And it was not a dissident problem. It was a planned, calculated, and contemplated genocide, mass murder, and for that reason, a crime against humanity. It's important for us to name the problem in veracity so that maybe we can begin to envisage and view a possible solution also in veracity. I want to start by talking about the political crime and fraud of the Unity Accord itself. In veracity and in justice, Kukuraundi was a structural, systemic, and also very societal crime against humanity. As I have said before, it involved the killing of history first, the killing of the truth and the information, and then later, the destruction of bodies of the victims. So the Unity Accord became a co-optation of the ZAPU political party by the ZANU political party. So a technical meeting and unity, if it was so, of two political parties does not even go near correcting or resolving the genocide that was structural, systemic, societal, and much deeper and higher than some ZAPU politicians and some ZANU politicians shaking hands and forming some kind of a government. And it is knowledge in the public domain that the Unity Accord itself as a document was a surrender document by ZAPU. It was part of ZANU-PF co-opting some ZAPU elites into itself in order to try and consolidate the de facto one-party states system that Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF had always fantasized of and desired. So that Unity Accord that brought ZANU-PF and ZAPU together and left the victims outside and left society outside was a kind of an elite co-optation project which constituted reconciliation without justice, which of course created peace that was not peace, that was just silence. The victims were silenced by the perpetrators using that Unity Accord and the process that brought ZANU-PF and ZAPU together in one party and one government. So the kind of reconciliation that was delivered here was reconciliation without justice, reconciliation without truth, reconciliation without reparations, reconciliation outside the perimeters of much needed transitional justice mechanisms, which makes then the Unity Accord part of the crime of the epistemicide that accompanied the Kukuraundi genocide. After saying that, I would like to move on to the important point, in my view, about the need for transitional justice as part of the condition for justice reconciliation, and healing in Zimbabwe, because the Kukurahundi genocide and the epistemicide sits so central on the Zimbabwean national question. If philosophers and theorists of the nation, like Benedict Anderson, are right that nations are imagined communities, there is no nation called Zimbabwe that can be imagined, that can be realized, that can be brought to being without a solution to as large a problem as the Kukurahundi genocide and the epistemicide. It is only to perform, to act, and to choreograph nationhood that can be done. Otherwise, a community, a nation called Zimbabwe will not exist without the resolution to the Kukurahundi problem. So it is important for us to not only describe and condemn the crime against humanity, but also to make propositions forward about what kind of transitional justice mechanism can be imagined and brought to be. The package of transitional justice that, in my view, I think Zimbabwe might need and might deserve if what is called the nation of Zimbabwe is to exist, is one that will include, first and foremost, truth-seeking, truth-finding, and truth-telling. Without truth as a condition, it is only to play, to imagine that there will be a solution to the Kukurahundi problem. The perpetrators will continue to act, to pretend, to perform, and disseminate rhetoric towards healing and reconciliation that will not work as long as the criminals are not known, the processes and events that accompanied the genocide are not clarified. There is also a need for trials and prosecutions for perpetrators, especially those that are not intending and do not intend to apologize or show some kind of remorse and regret for the crimes against humanity that were committed. And reparations. The genocide and epistemicide that accompanied it displaced people, dispossessed them, and robbed some of livelihoods, of futures, of life opportunities, and so forth. The government of Emmerson Mnangagwa right now says it will give birth certificates to orphans of Kukurahundi victims. This is almost 40 years later. How are these orphans going to go back to school? They will start seeking employment in their 40s and in their 50s. And they won't start afresh. Their futures were stolen, and those futures will not be returned. So there was material, social, cultural, and other forms of losses for which the victims necessarily need to be compensated. So the question of reparations is central. Then, as part of the transitional justice package, there are memorializations. Survivors and victims of this genocide and epistemicide need the freedom and the empowerment to openly, freely, and fairly remember what happened to them through monuments, through commemorations, through other events, and other religious, cultural, and political methods of memorializing that human beings get up to after such large-scale crimes as the Kukurahundi genocide and the epistemicide. Then and only then can people approach what can be called reconciliation and healing. And then and only then people can approach what can be imagined as closure after such a large-scale crime as the Kukurahundi genocide and epistemicide. Otherwise, what has been happening and what continues to happen is that the perpetrators of the Gugurawundi genocide and the epistemicide are conducting these exhumations, calling this genocide and this epistemicide a closed chapter, and also pretending to commitment about resolving the matter. But the crime continues because the perpetrators are continuing to cover up, to hide their identities, to pretend that they know they are Gugurawundi victims, but they are not mentioning the Gugurawundi victimizers. So at the end of the day, Gugurawundi becomes what one can say is a crime without a criminal, an offense without an offender. Because the names of the offenders, of the perpetrators and the victimizers are protected. We only see certain victims, those that are going to get birth certificate, those that are going to get the bodies of their relatives reburied and all that. But who were the criminals? Who are the criminals? We also need to see them come forward and come to disclose and explain and have their day in court or before a commission to tell us what happened and how it happened. So it cannot happen that people can achieve closure, reconciliation, and justice where the criminal is the one organizing these exhumations, these ceremonies, these processes, and the criminal continues to be covered up. This is called a closed chapter. It was a moment of madness, but whose madness was it? And all that. So it is important that the criminals are knowable and are known, just as the victims are knowable and are known. So without truth-telling, the government is only performing some rhetoric and choreographing some commitment, but that will not even go as close as anything that can resolve the matter. So as far as one can observe, the exhumations are ceremonial, symbolic, and also political and fraudulent because they are meant to conceal and not reveal the truth and the justice about this genocide and the epistemicide that I'm talking about. It's important also for one, in a platform like this one, to briefly look at the genealogy and provenance, maybe, of the Gugurawundi genocide. What enabled, what political climate, political geography, and political biography enabled this crime against humanity to be carried out with so much success and to occasion so much catastrophe and disaster? Right from the 60s, the 70s, especially the 70s, into the 1980s that we are talking about, where the genocide itself began, after the epistemicide was on course. ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe himself had a burning desire for a one-party state. Masipula Stole and John Makumbe talk about what they describe as a one-party state political psychology that, like a demon, possessed ZANU-PF under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, who as a person desired life presidency supported by his political party. So that burning desire and that one-party state political psychology necessitated that ZAPU as a political party be erased from the Zimbabwean political landscape. That Nkomo as a leader be eliminated. And that the white Rhodesian population of Zimbabwe be co-opted through the rhetoric of reconciliation. So white politics in Zimbabwe was silenced or minimized by use of the rhetoric of reconciliation. But Joshua Nkomo and ZAPU had remained a stumbling block. So the Kukurahundi genocide was then imagined. The North Koreans came to the party, and Robert Mugabe used it to eliminate ZAP from the landscape and to pursue the life presidency that he died still pursuing. And then there was the ideology of tribalism. The diverse and plural people that occupy the landscape, the geographic territory called Zimbabwe, did not naturally and normally become tribal and tribalist. Some elite politicians, especially in ZANU-PF, cultivated, irrigated, even manufactured and promoted tribalism as a political ideology. So the nation, what was supposed to be the nation of Zimbabwe, was tribalized. And tribalism was used as an ideology and a kind of a political passion that was used to divide the people of Zimbabwe. And that was also used to destroy whatever popularity Joshua Nkomo had in Mashonaland, which was massive popularity that existed. So the name of the tribe, ancestral names, were used to get Nkomo's name to retreat from Mashonaland and get isolated to Matebeleland and the Miklands. So tribalism played a huge part as an ideology, as a passion. And also the ideology of nativism. In the Zimbabwean education system, the Zimbabwean media, and socialization processes that were promoted and cultivated from a long time ago, the Ndebele people were constructed as Sekias, and the Shona people constructed as natives. It was injected into the mindsets, into the hearts, into the sensibility of the people of Mashonaland, in particular, that the people of Matebeleland, as a collective, as a nation, are Sekias. And that secret in a large part of the Zimbabwean population and became a passion that could be weaponized against the people of Matebeleland. And that continues to be weaponized against the people of Matebeleland. So there was nativism as an ideology and as a sensibility that was weaponized, and it came into play before, during, and right after the Kukurahundi genocide and epistemicide. There is also sickness that contributed to the Kukurahundi genocide in my observation. If one reads historians like Gerald Mazarire, Ngwabi Bebe, and one listens to narratives about what used to happen in the Zanla camps, the modes of discipline, punishment, the struggles within the struggle that Masipula Stole describes, you then understand that the leaders of that guerrilla movement became sick. People were being buried in pits. People were being tortured. Right inside the movement, women were being raped during the war and were put in some pits that were called the prison. They were called, Mazarire called Chikari Pozo or something like that. So people that have participated in such dehumanizing, diabolic methods of torture are people that cannot readily become democratic leaders. Those forms of torture, those kinds of evil that were happening in the Zanla camp produced demons, monsters, barbarians that were sick and could only lead by murder, by torture, by wounding, and not by democratic means. So I insist that some of the people that are leading Zimbabwe now, that graduated from the Zanla camps, from prisons, are people that are mentally sick and do not understand any political language besides the language of murder, wounding, bloodletting, and all that. So, together with the one-party political psychology, Mugabe's desire for a life presidency, the ideology of tribalism and nativism, I insist that there was sickness. Kulabantu abangaphilanga abagulayo abasuka baphatha intambo zombuso weZimbabwe kwadala ukuthi kufe abantu abaningi kungela sidingo njalo kungela sizathu
Proceeding from there, I want to benefit from Mahmoud Mamdani's study of the genocide in Rwanda. In his good book, When Natives Become Killers, Mamdan talks about silences that accompany genocide. I want to apply those silences in the Kukurahundi genocide and the epistemicide, how they applied in the process of the boiling over of history to the genocide, during the genocide, and after. He talks about the silence of history. Mamdan says people tend to ignore history in trying to understand genocide and look at it as an accident, not something that was planned, whose process was going on, and that could be foreseen and could be avoided. The Kukurahundi genocide was like that. There is a silence of history. Some Zipra cadres, under the leadership of Zapu and Joshua Nkomo, foresaw the genocide and were against the kind of processes that Nkomo agreed to in the Lancaster negotiations, because they foresaw the genocide. So there was a history starting in Morogoro, in Mkagawe, and during the liberation struggle, when Zipra and Zandra would shoot each other whenever they met, in Tumbane and elsewhere. So this genocide had a history. It was boiling over until it exploded after what is supposed to be called independence. Mamdan also talks about the silence of agency. When you talk to Zimbabweans now, from Mashonaland and Matebeleland and elsewhere, there's some kind of collective pretense that this was just a diabolic crime. It was conducted by a small group of ZANU-PF people and some small group of soldiers. It should not have happened. But there was urgency to Kukurahundi. At its time, there were people to whom Kukurahundi was a popular project. There are people who invested support and who enabled it to take place and who saw it as just deserts for the settlers in Matebeleland, for the Ndebele people, from ZAPU as a political party. But that agency, as part of the epistemicide, is getting erased and silenced. Everyone pretends that they were not part of it, they did not support it, and they should not be included in thinking about the genocide and the epistemicide. And also the silence of geography, which refers to the fact that the Kukurahundi genocide might have geographically happened in Matebeleland and the Midlands, and in Zimbabwe, territorially and geographically. But there are forces that are global, that are regional, that are international, and beyond that contributed to the cultivation and the irrigation of the genocide as a crime against humanity. There was the fear of the Ndebele people, right from their Zulu history in the Battle of Isandlwana. The fear of Joshua Nkomo and ZAPU and his connections to the Russian and Cuban communist movements. That fear was shared not by ZANU-PF, but also by the British government, by the American government, and their relevant allies. So when the attacks, as Timothy Skanesia says, began on ZAPU, on Zipra, on Joshua Nkomo and the Ndebele people, that collective of people were friendless, as Skanesia puts it. The British were willing to look aside, the Americans were willing to look aside, and Mugabe had given signs that he was willing to make Zimbabwe a bastion of capitalism against East European communism that was encroaching into the region. So the geography of Kukurahundi was beyond the territory of Zimbabwe and the landscape of Zimbabwe as a nation state. There were other factors that were regional, that were world systemic and structural in nature. And one can add to Mamdani's concepts the silence of biography, that there has been a concerted effort as part of the epistemicide of Kukuraundi to conceal the biographies of the people that committed the genocide, that planned it, and the names of the actors that actually fired the guns, that commanded the forces, and all that. So the silence of biography is also there, leading us to what I referred to before, to what is Kukuraundi as a crime that has no known criminal, because the criminals are being protected, concealed, and all that. And it makes you scared that those soldiers that were burning people alive, that were raping women, that were forcing mothers to sleep with their children, that were forcing people to cut each other's necks, they were just quietly and silently integrated into the army or hidden into society. What is their psychology? What are they doing? What other crimes are they committing? Are they okay in their minds? And what are they doing where they are? So that leads me back to what I said, that there can never be a Zimbabwean nation with such criminals, with such people that were abused like that, that were used like that, quietly assimilating into the nation, and then everyone pretends that all is well, there's Zimbabwe and there are Zimbabweans. So the national question in Zimbabwe is in trouble, because there are criminals that are concealed, whose biographies are protected from knowledge, from justice, from ethics, and all that. After looking at that, I think it is important that we also look at the content of Kukuraundi as a genocide and also an epistemicide. By content, I mean, what was this? What is it that was done? And how was it done? It was a military, tribal, and partisan operation. Military, tribal, and partisan operation. It constituted physical rape of women by the Kukuraundi soldiers themselves, and by victims that were forced to rape their sisters, their mothers, and there was torture, burning people with drops of burning plastic, arson, the kind of killing that was done to Solomon Mujuru, just killing people and burning them in their houses, was commonplace during Kukuraundi. Arson, burning people alive, and also the diabolic act of getting people to dig a pit as a number of people and then getting them to go inside, and then you force some of them to shovel their friends or relatives in that pit where they are going to be buried forever. There was also murder by shootings and stabbings, those bayonets that the 5th Brigade had. And acts that can be described as terrorism, because they were conducted in order to terrify people forever, scare them forever, burning their homes and getting children to watch their parents being murdered and all that. Kukuraundi had a terrorism element to it. And then there were biological tools and poisons. People that were forced to drink poisons. Poisons that were put in dams where keki were drinking and where people were drinking. All those things are not spoken about. And let me deposit this. Kukuraundi was accompanied by acts of witchcraft, disemboweling of bodies. Some bodies were left with some body parts missing. The relatives and families do not know where those body parts went. There were ritual killings, killings that were ritual-like, that accompanied Kukuraundi. Acts that can be called acts of sorcery and satanism, where heads were found alone there, arms there, parts of bodies missing. And the actual event of human bodies that are missing, people that were disappeared, and relatives and families do not know where those bodies went and what was done with them, belongs to that assortment of acts that can be called acts of sorcery and witchcraft. If you want to understand what I'm talking about, like all other God-fearing and maybe God-loving people, like most of you, I do not believe in witchcraft. But the people that committed the Kukuraundi genocide and epistemicide believe in witchcraft and the occult. Just look at what Mugabe did before he died. He instructed his wife, amongst other instructions, that do not allow any of the people that conducted the coup or the people in ZANU-PF to come near my body. Stay by my coffin until I am buried on the ground. Mugabe said that in fear that his body parts and other things were going to be harvested and used for witchcraft and sorcery and occult purposes. And this is Mugabe talking about the people that he led. So he knew better. So like all of you, I don't believe in witchcraft. But the people that conducted this genocide do believe in witchcraft and practice acts that are ritualistic, that belong to sorcery, to Satanism, and the occult, which can be part of the sickness that I spoke about that contributed to the genealogy and the provenance of the genocide itself. We have missing bodies, missing body parts, and all that was part of the genocide. And I'm trying to describe the content, the evil, the Satanism, and the witchcraft of the act. Yeah. If you talk to villagers, they will tell you ghoulish and hellish stories about what these soldiers used to do. Some drank blood, some conducted acts that were otherworldly and can be referred to as witchcraft. And Kukuraundi itself as an epistemicide. Let's look it in the eye. What information and what history is being erased, is being concealed, is being killed, is being murdered as part of this epistemicide? First is the statistics. There is no settlement up to now how many dead bodies were delivered by the Kukuraundi genocide. So the epistemicide alongside the genocide has ensured that those facts have not been brought forward. The speculations and estimations start from 3,000 right up to 50,000. But the victims will tell you that Kukuraundi dead bodies were far more than 50,000. That is not talking about the displacements, loss of properties, dispossessions, and the loss of life and loss of life opportunities that happened because of the genocide, and the loss of political will, cultural will, and social will, and sensibility and being of the people of the Midlands and Matebeleland. That has not been quantified. It has always been concealed. And more importantly, there was, not the most important, but also important, is the theft of the physical ZAPU records and the Zipra roll that were at Ascot Farm and at Nest Egg Farm, which role was then used to follow up Zipra cadres in their families and elsewhere and target them for murder. And which role and the records, their hiding and their concealment continues to erase the role that ZAPU and Zipra and the people of the Midlands and Matebeleland played in Zimbabwe's war for independence. That is an epistemicide. That is a crime against humanity that needs to be resolved. And the stolen futures that the people of the Midlands and Matebeleland had their futures stolen. Some became orphans that could not go to school, that could not work. Some came to be exiled. They ran into other countries. They became stateless and nationless. And many of them, the multitudes, remain so. And that problem, that disadvantage, that marginality has not been openly addressed. There are also concealments of the mass graves themselves. I'll tell you this. There is evidence that during the land reform program, the fast-track land reform program, there were lands in Matebeleland where specific people were settled. People from the security forces or people connected to the intelligence who were settled in those areas, and they came to own that land because in that land there are concealed graves, mass graves that must not be known, that must not be seen. So right during the land reform program, some concealments of Kukuraund were taking place in who was given this land, who was given that farm. Certain strategic and well-placed people were put in certain farms where certain bodies and certain groups of people have their bodies under the soil. There's also the problem of linguicide. I read today that there's a lawyer in Bulawayo that is suing the office of the registrar or the government for the mutilation of the Ndebele language in the Zimbabwean passport. And it's not only in the passports, the national ID, public communication, posters, in business documents, official records, and elsewhere where the language, what Nguki wa Thiong'o calls linguicide, the killing of a language, is systematically and structurally being killed in an attempt that after some years there will be no language called Ndebele, and maybe no people called Ndebele, or no people called Nanshona, and all that. And as I said before, there are no people of Zimbabwe that were normally and naturally tribalistic. This tribalism, in its systemic and structural nature, was cultivated by ZANU-PF politicians, the elites, for purposes of political power. And they are using that tribalism up to today. So there is the problem of linguicide as part of the epistemicide, the killing of the Ndebele language, culture, sensibility, and identity. And there's population engineering. I'll say this again, even during the same fast-track land reform program. Before that fast-track land reform program, anyway, there was a program that was led by John Nkomo called Decongestion Program. I have some records about it, where people were moved from other parts of the country to be settled in Matebeleland. Well, the political reasons, the reasons were given as decongestion, that there were other areas of Zimbabwe that were congested and people needed to be resettled. But the political reasons were population engineering. And even during the land fast-track land reform program, there was concerted effort in engineering the population, ensuring that there is no place where you can say there are Ndebele people that live here. To ensure that the population gets nicely diluted and that memory of Ndebele as a group that was isolated for murder slowly dies as people begin to see each other as one. For people to see each other as one is not a crime, but to manipulate that seeing each other as one to conceal a genocide is a crime. So there was population engineering, and there is population engineering that is covertly and overtly being done in Zimbabwe as part of the epistemicide. And even the fact that in textbooks, in the education curriculum, in the media, and elsewhere, talking about the Kukuraund genocide is not open, is not free, is not fair, constitutes the epistemicide that I'm talking about. And we now need, before I belabor that, we need to go to another important slide that I said I'm going to talk about today, which is the invention of the dissidents. Part of the big excuse that was used for the Kukuraund genocide, first was the arms cache that were found, which Zapu explained and said, Zanga and Zipra had arms that they concealed in fear that the Rhodesians were going to renege from the Lancaster Agreement. So both armies had weapons, but the weapons that Zap had were criminalized as weapons of an insurgency. And ZAPU was also taking care of weapons that belonged to the ANC. That is on records of ZAPU and records of the ANC. Those weapons were now criminalized. And then there was the murder of those 6 tourists from Europe. That was conducted by so-called dissidents, which it has come to the fore if you read Kevin Woods. And if you listen to what Patrick Joao said soon after the coup, that that kidnapping of the tourists was choreographed. It was carried out by members of the Central Intelligence Organization simply in order to soil the name of Joshua Nkomo and of that of ZAPU and ZIPRA, and give credence and justification for a military onslaught onto Matebeleland and the Migrants. It was meant to alarm the world and disgust the world so that they could look aside, so that US will look aside, UK will look aside as Mugabe massacred the people in the Migrants and Matebeleland. And then after those excuses, what were the dissidents and who were the dissidents? It's important to focus and look at the identity and the constitution of who the dissidents were, what they were, and what the nature of their command was. I read Milestone, this well-researched book. What I'm trying to do here is I want to insist first that dissidents existed, that there were people that could be called dissidents and bandits. But now let's go to who were they, what they were they about, and what was the nature of their command. I want to insist that dissidents existed, but how were they invented? How were they produced? And what was the nature of their command? I think those are the 3 important questions under this subtopic. I've outlined the arms cache as one of the excuses, and also the kidnapping of those tourists as one of the excuses. And the tourists were important because they were European and white extraction, which was really to annihilate ZAPU and its name in the West and all that. Right? So I say dissidents did exist. First, I was reading Milestone, this well-researched book, a book that was produced with some of the most admirable social science work that can be witnessed. It's not known by many people that Zanla had dissidents. That is the General Solomon Mujuru instructed 3,000 Zanla guerrillas from Mozambique not to report to the assembly points and remain outside for what they will be needed to do, which was to campaign for ZANU-PF during the first independence elections of Zimbabwe. What these dissidents and bandits that did not report to the assembly points, were not integrated into the national army, went on to do, nobody knows. But it's a fact that Zanla had its own dissidents that were created. They were instructed not to join the national army, not to report to the assembly points, and not to go for the retraining that was being done, because they needed to be utilized and weaponized for political purposes by ZANU-PF. The apartheid regime in South Africa created, promoted, and produced its own dissidents that were unleashed into Matebeleland to cause terror, instability, and keep the Zimbabwean entity busy on itself, not on other issues outside the border. You know about Super ZAPU and all that. So the apartheid regime was very much interested in dissidents and what dissidents were doing. And there was a an elite coalition, conspiracy between ZANU-PF at intelligence level and the South African apartheid regime at intelligence level. Timothy Skaneshia has captured what is in the records here about 2 kilometers from where I am, in the South African declassified archives library close to the Union buildings, that there was overt cooperation between ZANU-PF and the apartheid regime. And there's one documented meeting which was attended by Emmerson Mnangagwa in person as the Minister of Intelligence and Security, where a pact was reached. It's even documented in Skaneshia that ZAPU and the ANC are supposed to be finished off on Zimbabwean soil. And that elite intelligence and military pact, which is on record, some declassified records say that, produced its own dissidents, agents, provocateurs, killers, assassins that furthered the interest of that alliance. And then there were Zipra deserters from the ZNA. Milestone documents how Zipra cadres in the ZNA barracks were hounded, killed, tortured, imprisoned, threatened. Some of them with their guns ran away. Some of them retired early. Others were eliminated and others were put in jail. In Milestone, this critical narrative, some were saved by Solomon Juru, who alerted them that you are going to be killed, run for your life. Some crossed borders and went to South Africa and others. And those people became what can be called dissidents. And as I said before, there are Zipra cadres that foresaw the genocide, especially the Gwai troop, that were uneasy about joining the National Army, and that disobeyed Nkomo and ZAPU and ran away into the bush and became deserters. What does that bring us to? It brings us to a picture as to how dissidents came to be. I haven't finished. Besides the disgruntled Zipra cadres, there were 5th Brigade actors. If you read Kevin Woods, that was at the time an insider in the CIO, in the army, and elsewhere. The CIO choreographed dissidents, soldiers that were taken, dressed in tatters, and sent to villages to pretend to be dissidents, commit crimes, robberies, and other things. And then tomorrow, another group will come in neat fatigues, following up on the dissidents that came yesterday, shooting people, killing them, and doing the diabolic and satanic crimes that I described earlier. So there were dissidents that were actors, that were directed from the CIO and the 5th Brigade. Many people in Cholocho and Nkai and elsewhere in Plumtree will tell you that there were dissidents that were moving around and could not even speak fluent Isindebele or Kalanga or Tonga or Venda or Nambia, and were calling themselves Zipra dissidents that were fighting government and all that. But it was all a performance that was meant to justify the onslaught. And then there were Central Intelligence Organization dissidents proper. Kevin Woods narrates, or should I say confesses, because he was part of this act, that there were people like Gaikusu that were moved around in police vehicles and in CIO vehicles and told to attack farms, homesteads, and other strategic targets to create an international picture of instability, insurgency in Matebeleland. And many people today know Gaikusu as a former dissident. No one knows that Gaikusu is a former implant of the CIO in Matebeleland. And there are many other dissidents of that nature that got known and all that. All that information about the genealogy, the invention, the production of the dissidents has never been confronted as part of this epistemicides that I'm talking about. And the important observation there is that there were never any dissidents that were under the command of Joshua Nkomo or ZAPU. That there were never any dissidents that were an organized group, organized by ZAPU or ZIPRA for purposes of toppling the elected government of Zimbabwe. These were disparate groups created by their grievances and their problems, their sponsors, and other interested parties, including ZANU-PF itself, the State Security Ministry, the president, and his elite political clique that commanded the Kukuraundi genocide. When they claimed that the genocide was to deal with the dissidents, they needed to perform dissidents and show that they were dissidents. So they participated in creating, producing, sponsoring, even circulating, distributing dissidents so that they could have a story to say that we have an insurgency that we need to deal with. That, in my view, is the picture of who the dissidents were, what they were, and what the nature of their command was like. There were no dissidents that were commanded by Joshua Nkomo, Dumiso Tabengwa, Lookout Masuku, and others. You will notice that even the current establishment led by Emerson Mnangagwa himself is a dissident establishment that cannot survive without dissidents. When those dissidents are not there, they create them. You are told that they are Mashurugwis. They have raided this mine. They have robbed this place. They have killed these villagers. If you look at how the police react to those Mashurugwis, how the police respond to that, you realize that there are no Mashurugus. These are part of the state security and insecurity mechanism, participating in the gold wars, diamond wars, and other wars for resources that the president, his friends, and others are participating in, as well-known black marketeers that are participating in the plundering of resources in Zimbabwe, and the fight for mining claims in Matebeleland, Midlands, and other places. You are told that there are these Mashurukwis, they are mysterious, no one knows where they come from. If you have studied Kukuraundi and how the security minister then operated, you will understand where the Mashurukwis come from, where they report, and who their actual godfather is. Right. In closing, I think, as I said before, the Kukuraundi genocide and its epistemicide sits centrally on the Zimbabwean national question, and cannot be let to proceed without a resolution. Because you cannot imagine or bring to bear a true, just, and fair community of people called Zimbabweans when part of that community has been isolated for murder at mass scale and nothing has been done about it. That cannot happen. And democracy itself cannot come to fruition in Zimbabwe if part of that population goes to elections knowing, having the memory that a genocide can happen to them again. So justice is needed. And what I said before when I spoke about transitional justice, there's need for institutional reform. You can't have figureheads that are known, people that are well known as Kukuraundi operatives holding public offices, leading public institutions. What are you saying to the victims, to those that suffered in the hands of those people? And some of them anyway have suffered already from the same Kukuraundi that they perpetrated. Because as part of Kukuraundi I talked about poisoning The problem of poisoning in Zimbabwe is a story for another day, which needs a full presentation on its own. You are told that people like Parents Shiri died of COVID-19. But if you look carefully, you realize that it was an act of poisoning. There are so many politicians that have died in Zimbabwe of multiple organ failure, cancer, HIV, AIDS, sugar, diabetes, and all that. But these are slow poisons whose use has always been part of the ZANU-PF security and insecurity arsenal. So stability, justice, and security and fearlessness cannot be achieved in Zimbabwe as long as poisoners, arsonists, assassins, rapists, and other criminals are at large, and some of them are in the government. By the way, Parents Shiri is the only politician who died, or person who died, and the president went to the funeral carrying a post-mortem document to actually confirm that he died of COVID, which is very interesting. So without justice, there cannot be reconciliation, healing, and closure. And even the idea of Zimbabwe having been decolonized and liberated is untrue if a section of the population is still such aggrieved, still such offended. And truth, justice, and satisfaction are still at large, are pending, have not been delivered. The whole idea of Zimbabwe having been liberated, being independent, being united, being a country and a nation is false if the question of Gukurahundi is not addressed. At this stage, I would like to end my short presentation and thank you, the 1893 movement, for this opportunity, and those colleagues, friends, and others that have been listening to my humble offering. Thank you very much.